Within the Mario Kart mythos, there are certain questions that always end up creeping into every fan's minds at least once during their lifetimes. Questions like, why is Coconut Mall so popular? Or how did this dumbass bee ever get a spot as a playable racer in a Mario Kart game that no one ever talks about anymore? Now those questions have plausible answers, but there is one such question that has eluded some of the greatest minds to ever exist. That question is, which Mario Kart has the hardest special cup? In order to answer this question, I'll be locking in and racing through each special cup 20 times, all while taking in my median placements for each and comparing them against one another. To keep things as consistent as possible, we will be racing through each of these cups as Mario in the standard kart for that game. We will also be racing through each track at 150cc, as it was the fastest mode accessible in each and every entry. With the specifics out of the way, I think it's time we strapped in as we figure out which Mario Kart has the hardest special cup, and where better to start than with the game that kickstarted the whole franchise. Now, there's two types of people in this world, those who have played Super Mario Kart and dumbasses like me who expected it to be the easiest game ever because how could a game built on ancient software pose any type of challenge at all? I mean, the tracks are some of the simplest in the entire franchise, so surely that means I just breezed through all of them like it was nothing, right?
My disappointment is immeasurable.
How long's it been in this video? Like 2 minutes? Yeah. So after spending an hour failing over and over on Donut Plains 3, I made the embarrassing decision to lower the difficulty down to 100cc. And why is that, you ask? Well, at least we'll have some actual data to look at in this case. That being said, even at 100cc, this game poses quite the challenge. For anyone that hasn't played Super Mario Kart, it's probably the hardest game in the entire franchise. The controls are extremely slippery to the point where you're probably better off not drifting at all when going around turns. Not only that, but the CPUs in this game blatantly cheat, activating lightspeed on their karts the very moment you pass them. Now it's not like the tracks are easy either. They're simple, sure, but the number of winding turns and gaps in the bridge make even Donut Plains 3 a rough venture. Not only that, but can someone explain to me how this little dirt patch here acts in the same manner as ice physics? Like why am I sliding around these turns when it's supposed to be dirt or mud, which makes even less sense if I'm being honest. The cup doesn't get any easier as we dive into Cooper Beach too, and I don't mean that metaphorically either. Now, all things considered, there aren't as many areas to fly off course, but there are a considerable number of cheaps who always manage to be in the most annoying spots possible. The usual slipperiness doesn't have too much of an impact on this track, but it certainly does on the next one. Ghost Valley 3 is a decently challenging track. The first lap isn't too bad as the edges are lined with guardrails, but as people hit them, they slowly break away. What you're left with is an extremely tight course with sharp turns and nothing to stop you should you scoot a little too far around them. Add in large gaping holes and you've got a track where you'll spend more time off it than on it. Now should you survive Ghost Valley 3, you then have to race across Vanilla Lake 2. This track has you racing around a lake.
Well, duh.
The challenge here though is the fact that everything is covered in ice. Now driving on ice in Super Mario Kart is like adding pink Himalayan salt to regular table salt as a means of making it saltier. I mean, the game already has inbuilt ice physics with how slippery your kart is, with this added ice only adding to the challenging nature of the track. The Special Cup concludes with a track that's gone on to become a household name in the franchise, Rainbow Road, and within 15 seconds of playing it, I had realized where its notorious reputation had come from. It's not even a complex track. Sure, there's a few whomps here and there, but the main challenge comes from trying to stay on said track. There are no railings here, and should even a single pixel touch that gap, you're cooked. Wait, what? Huh? As you can probably tell, I got my ass handed to me by Super Mario Kart's Special Cup. Surprisingly though, Rainbow Road wasn't the hardest track, with Donut Plains 3 taking that title, with an average placement of 2.3. As for the cup itself, my median ranking was 1.8, which honestly could be high or it could be low. There's nothing really to compare it to yet. For now though, let's move on to the next big installment in this fabled franchise, Mario Kart 64. 64's Special Cup opens up with DK's Jungle Parkway, a rather unique course that mixes in windy roads and cute shortcuts on an otherwise simple track. The controls of 64 are far more intuitive than in Super Mario Kart, so there won't be any need to lower the speed down to 100cc here. Honestly, DK Jungle's Parkway is a breath of fresh air compared to the previous tracks I struggled through. The track has relatively easy turns and the shortcut at the end is easy enough to pull off. Definitely the easiest track we've encountered so far. Yoshi Valley on the other hand does up the challenge quite a bit. Yoshi Valley acts more like a maze than a racetrack, with numerous pathways that branch out, each with their own difficulty curve. Some paths have obstacles, some have extremely narrow roads, while others have sharp turns, and it's up to the player in this regard to make their own decision about which pathway they want to take. The other unique aspect of this track has to do with its mysterious placement system, or lack thereof. The only time you'll know where you place is when you cross that finish line, and that feeling of uncertainty, believe it or not, does add a dash of pressure to the already rough experience that comes with this track. Banshee's Boardwalk is 64's rendition of Ghost Valley. I'd say in general it's slightly easier than Ghost Valley as the railings don't shatter when slamming into them, but there are a few segments like the zigzag road or the inside section with the bats that can trip you up if you're not careful. The cup finishes off once again with the infamous Rainbow Road. Now I'm not sure if this is going to be a hot take or not, but I honestly believe 64's Rainbow Road to be the easiest iteration of the track to ever exist. The roads are extremely wide, the turns aren't exactly sharp, and the track is lined by railings the whole way around, making it practically impossible to fall off. The only annoyance I can even think of is the chain chomps that bite your ass every once in a while. But outside of that, this track isn't just one of the easiest rainbow roads. It might just be the easiest track in the entire cup. What wasn't the easiest track though was certainly Yoshi's Valley, with its maze-like structure resulting in it having the highest average placement of 1.85. My median placement for 64 Special Cup was 1.5, implying that it was a step down in terms of difficulty when compared to its predecessor. We've entered the world of handhelds with this next one, which also happens to be the most neglected game in the entire franchise. Don't believe me? Well, what if I asked you to name the tracks of Super Circuit Special Cup? I'm waiting. Yeah, look, I don't know them either. So the cup actually starts off with Lakeside Park, and don't let its simple layout fool you. This track can seriously fuck you over. Continuing the theme of each new iteration, Super Circuit controls in a completely different manner than the first two games while retaining some of that slipperiness from Super Mario Kart. This makes drifting around this track's winding turns quite awkward, and there's one spot in particular where if you hit the wall in a certain way, you can jump yourself straight over to the other side. Now that sounds pretty cool, right? Well, it would be if it didn't act as a long kart. Is that an actual term? What I was trying to say is it sends you back to the first section of the track. This already makes it pretty much impossible to catch up, but if you're a special type of dog shit, then you won't do this just once, but twice, in the same race. Thankfully Broken Pier isn't quite as bad. Ah shit. Okay, it's pretty bad. Broken Pier lives up to its name for sure. It's quite literally a pier, with very windy wooden roads that are falling apart, leaving plenty of gaps to fly into if you're not careful. The slipperiness of this game in particular makes avoiding all of these gaps quite the challenge. Now to my surprise, we've arrived at the first Bowser's Castle to be included in a special cup. I know it's a staple of the cups these days, but feel free to fact check me on that one. Bowser's Castle tracks have always held a strange place in my heart. They're not quite as infamous as the Rainbow Roads, but they certainly offer a decent challenge, and this first iteration may be one of the hardest. Now it's not complex by any means, and it's not like there's countless obstacles as we'll come to see in future iterations, but the track itself is designed in a way where each tight turn opens up into a longer stretch full of gaps leading straight to the lava. But while it may seem pretty simple, I think it works incredibly well alongside the awkward controls of Super Circuit to make this one of the more challenging tracks in the game. With that being said, it's most definitely not the hardest. I'm sure we all know which track takes that spot. This is probably the strangest Rainbow Road in the history of Mario Kart. It's got all the usual telltales of a Rainbow Road, plenty of windy roads and speed boosts that will shoot you straight off into orbit if you're not careful, as well as narrow roads with no railings. But it's this lack of railings that makes this Rainbow Road unique. See, instead of flying straight off to your death, in Super Circuit you bounce off each of these edges, which can result in some pretty crazy shortcuts if you're actually good. I'm not. So this has quickly become quite the traumatic experience for me. Overall, Super Circuit Special Cup proved to be quite the challenging experience. To no one's surprise, Rainbow Road took its rightful place as the hardest track in the cup, with my median ranking of 1.75 placing it as one of the harder cups in the franchise. After revisiting all of these games, it's truly amazing just how different each one feels from the last, and this definitely continues into Mario Kart Double Dash. Double Dash, as I'm sure you all know, lets you pick two characters to race as. As I've limited myself to only playing as Mario, it only seems fitting to pick his green partner in crime as my second racer. Double Dash's Special Cup opens up with Wario Coliseum, and once again the drifting mechanics of this game are all over the place. I wouldn't say they're nearly as bad as Super Mario Karts or Super Circuits, but they do take some time to get used to. Thankfully, Wario Coliseum has plenty of wider turns which lets you practice the new drifting mechanics. I will say that the Mario Brothers special item isn't the best, especially when you can kind of just take yourself out. Wait, how do I come out worse from my own item? What the f? Dino Dino Jungle is a track that I honestly completely forgot about, and that certainly made it a lot harder to race around when looking to avoid the numerous stomps or cute faces that seemingly popped out of nowhere. The track also contains some of the windier roads, many of which led into very narrow passageways that you're able to fall off if you're not too careful. Kind of a dark horse track if I'm being honest. What isn't a dark horse though is this iteration of Bowser's Castle. This is about the point where they started upping the ante on these tracks in particular. You've got narrow corridors lined with womps, you've got your usual fire-based obstacles, and you even have a moving Bowser monument that shoots out fireballs. Strange how they've never used that idea again. Oh, and of course you've got your gaps that I somehow always seem to get knocked into. Don't you dare dive your... Now this might be a bit of a hot take, but I think Double Dash's Rainbow Road is the hardest of the bunch. Not only does it have extremely tight turns paired with very narrow roads with no railings, but the whole concept of more items in this iteration makes the whole thing a complete nightmare. I mean, look at this. You're not only trying to stay on the road, but half of it is covered in shit. Oh, and you can't even properly drift around this first spiral without flying off the edge, but that's most likely because I'm garbage. Either way, I've always struggled a lot with this iteration of Rainbow Road. It shouldn't come as a surprise then when I tell you that it was by far the hardest track in the entire Special Cup. That being said, my average medium placement of 1.625 puts Double Dash in quite an interesting spot when compared to the rest of the games in this series. Back and forth we go from console to handheld as we move on to Mario Kart DS, and more specifically Wario Stadium. The track itself is fairly simple, there's a few areas that have mud pits that slow you down, but outside of those and a few fire wheels there's not too much to really trip you up. The layout does include a little heart in it, which I always found to be kind of cute, but it doesn't necessarily make for a challenging track. Peach Garden sits in a similar boat as Wario Stadium, and despite it having tighter turns and more obstacles in the form of Monty Moles and moving chain chomps, the overall width of the roads and the sublime controls of the DS iteration make this track even easier in my opinion than Wario Stadium. One of the central gimmicks that was introduced in Mario Kart DS was snaking, and you've probably noticed that I haven't been doing it. That's because it's fairly inconsistent with medium weight cars and it's most effective on long straight roads, which honestly, not many of these tracks have. Bowser's Castle is where I'd say the Special Cup finally ups the challenge. It's got your usual suspects, thwomps in the hallways, and plenty of lava pits to fall into. That combined with the tight corridors and chaotic nature of Mario Kart in general make this one of the more tougher tracks to race through. But as we've come to expect, the true terror lies at the end of each Special Cup, with this latest iteration continuing this trend. Like any other Rainbow Road, this one features pretty narrow roads, with hardly any railings to stop you from being pushed off. There are also some pretty unique interactions that can happen on these maps, and you bet your sweet ass after racing through this track 20 times, I would have seen a good few of them. What's happening? Wait, what the f is going on? The windy turns at the end, which happened to be where I flew off the map the most, also managed to be right before the finish line. I feel like Nintendo knew exactly what they were doing there. All of those things combined make Rainbow Road the hardest track in this Special Cup. Overall though, the cup proved to be one of the easiest with an average median ranking of 1.125. Welcome to the world of bikes. Or not, because we're sticking with Mario in his standard kart.
Ooh, you suck!
Yes, that means no Funky Kong Flame Runner cheese, but with that being said, this particular Special Cup certainly doesn't need it. The cup starts out with dry ruins, and everything from its theming to its layout are just that, dry as fuck. With tracks like Cooper Cape and Coconut Mall, it was inevitable that some had to be duds, and unfortunately the Special Cup is starting off with one. Now the track does have some interesting features like the large circular room that fills up with sand over the course of the race. Honestly though, there's nothing about this course that's even remotely challenging. The pokies are slow and easy to avoid, and even if they weren't, the roads are extremely wide with the only section to include sharp turns, being aided by boost strips that line the walls and shoot you off in the perfect direction anyway. Definitely one of the easiest tracks we've raced through. Moonview Highway on the other hand definitely had the potential to be a challenging track. I have to give it to the Wii version, as there seems to be far more vehicles lining the roads than its 8 Deluxe counterpart. Even then though, the latter half of the course is just free reign, with a billion lanes and hardly any vehicles to cause any type of problem. The hardest part is probably at the very start, where you're not sure if there are cars turning around the tight bends. Even then though, the latter half gives you more than enough time to catch up should you ever fall behind. We now move on to my favourite iteration of Bowser's Castle. Now despite it being my favourite, it certainly isn't the hardest, and although it has your typical thwomps and even a cool section with the familiar looking Bowser monument that shoots fireballs. Haven't we seen that before? The roads are much wider than previous iterations, making drifting around the sharper turns far easier in general. The Special Cup once again finishes off with Rainbow Road, and this one may be the most recognizable track in Mario Kart history, from its music to its aesthetic and even its unique animations that see you plummeting towards the earth. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't have some kind of nostalgic memory tied to this track. That being said, it's pretty easy, let's be real. Sure, there's no railings like usual, but the roads are fairly wide and the turns aren't particularly sharp or windy either. Yes, just like any other Rainbow Road, you'll most likely find yourself off track, whether that's because someone knocks you off, or you got some dirt in your eye and you accidentally boosted yourself off. But even in those rare cases, it's fairly simple to claw your way back for the win. Now, to everyone's surprise, I'm sure, Rainbow Road didn't prove to be the hardest track in Wii's Special Cup. That title belongs to Bowser's Castle. But how could that be? Didn't I essentially say it was one of the easiest iterations? Well, shit happens.
No fucking way. Nah. We remote's going through the TV.
We're back on the handhelds with this one in what is arguably the most overlooked Mario Kart. Thankfully, Mario Kart 7 took much of its mechanics from its DS counterpart, and as such drives like a dream. That being said, its tracks certainly aren't as lax as DS's, with many of them featuring far more complex designs. This can be seen almost immediately in the Special Cup's first track, DK Jungle. As the name suggests, DK Jungle contains a whole ass ecosystem within it, many creatures like frogs, Tiki Goons, and these stone pillars that scream, acting as rather annoying obstacles. Throw in some windy turns and you've got a decently challenging track to start us off. Thankfully for the masochists though, this cup only looks to get harder in the following tracks as we enter into Rosalina's Ice World. Now, all things considered, this track has one main problem, that being that there isn't much of a track left, as much of the ice has completely fallen to the wayside. What's left is large gaps that are always situated either around bending turns or next to speed boosts, two of the best places large gaps could possibly be. Oh, and these icicles can be fairly annoying as well, considering your cart loves to home in on them. Now, I want you guys to be honest here. Does anyone actually remember Bowser's Castle from Mario Kart 7? I'm not saying it's bad, but I mean, I played through it 20 times just for this video, and even still I can't remember much of it. I do remember thinking its layout left much to be desired though, but I will say it did have some rather fun winding roads, with little gaps here and there, or fire pillars that made things somewhat challenging. Outside of that though, I can't say this track posed too much of a challenge when compared to the rest of the Special Cup roster. And speaking of the rest of the roster, we arrive at one of the best Rainbow Roads in Mario Kart history, and yes, I'm willing to die on that rock. Mario Kart 7's Rainbow Road isn't just good though, it's one of the harder iterations purely because it doesn't have repeating laps. Each segment is completely different from the last, and each one comes with its own challenges, whether that's winding turns around planets, awkward gaps in Saturn's rings, or massive chain chomps you have to avoid while zooming across the moon's irregular surface. It's definitely not the hardest Rainbow Road, but it does wrap up a cup in a fairly underappreciated game in a fabulous way. Now, it may not be the hardest Rainbow Road in this series, but it did prove to be the most challenging in Mario Kart 7 Special Cup with an average placement of 1.8. In terms of the overall rankings though, Mario Kart 7 seems to place towards the midpoint of the group, with an average median ranking of 1.375. We have arrived at the final and most recent Mario Kart game. What was that? Mario Kart Tour? Yeah, never heard of it. Now, despite Mario Kart 8 introducing the fabled 200cc racing mode, to keep things consistent with the previous entries, we will be sticking with a 150cc. The cup opens up with Cloud Top Cruise, which is a decent challenge on 200cc. On 150 though, it's pretty simple. There are a few sharper turns just before the launch pad, but past that it's just thick roads with the occasional lightning zap. Overall, a pretty easy track to start us off. We drop from the heavenly heights of Cloud Top Cruise straight into the harsh deserts of Bone Dry Dunes. Thankfully, the track itself isn't quite as harsh as its climate. It does up the ante on winding turns, featuring far more of them than its sky-high predecessor. These tighter turns mostly congregate towards the start of the track though, giving you plenty of time in the latter half to make up any distance lost due to bad RNG, or in my case, trash driving. We move on to the final iteration of Bowser's Castle, and you know what they say, you save the best for last. Unless you're Mario Kart. Okay, no, look, the track is fine. There's plenty of obstacles to avoid like geysers, fire bars, and even a massive moving Bowser monument. Again. But there's also far too much space to take turns, and at 150cc the speed limit is far too slow to make any of it that challenging, especially when compared to some of the castles we've had to race through before. This all leads us to the final iteration of Mario Kart's most infamous track, Rainbow Road. Rainbow Road. Deluxe. There's got to be something that we can use to differentiate all these tracks. Like many of its predecessors, this Rainbow Road offers a decent challenge, with plenty of narrow roads, sharp turns, many of which don't even have barriers to save you from plummeting off the track, and the usual clusterfuck of other races all spamming items at each other, resulting in a rather chaotic experience. Even so, I wouldn't consider this a particularly hard iteration of the infamous track, and on 150cc in particular, I'd argue it's actually one of the easiest. That may also be because we've been racing the same goddamn track for the last 10 years. But I mean, what do you want me to say? There's no Mario Kart 10. Now, despite me flexing how easy Rainbow Road is, it still proved to be the hardest out of the 4 tracks covered with an average placement of 1.35. The same can't be said about the cup itself, which ranked as one of the easiest with a median placement rank of 1.25. Speaking of rankings though, I think it's time we answer the question posed at the start of the video. Which Mario Kart has the hardest Special Cup? To answer that question, let's first identify the easiest, those being Mario Kart DS and Mario Kart Wii. When it comes to gameplay, I believe these two were the first ones to perfect not only the physics engine, but also the design of many of its tracks. In saying that, I do think some of the tracks could have been scaled up in terms of difficulty, as they often featured very wide turns and relatively simple shortcuts. But all in all, I'd be lying if I said they weren't a blast to play on. Mario Kart 8 follows them as the next easiest, and while I believe its tracks are far more complex, I think playing this game for as long as we have has made 150cc kind of a joke. The only time you're not coming first is either bad RNG, or screwing around while trying to keep things interesting while you race around bone-dry dunes for the 16th time in a row. Mario Kart 7 marks the halfway point alongside Mario Kart 64, with the latter being far harder, mainly due to its primitive controls that take some time getting used to. Moving up into the top 3, we're starting off with Double Dash, which not only features some extremely unique controls, mainly due to its drifting mechanics, but also some decently challenging tracks. Rainbow Road in particular, as we've discussed, has some incredibly challenging turns, some of which you can't even drift around properly. Even so, it doesn't compare to Super Circuit, which takes the second top spot for its slippery mechanics and fast-paced gameplay. Having to drift around sharp turns when you can barely see what's in front of you makes Super Circuit's Special Cup an absolute nightmare. Pretty much all of the tracks have no safety precautions, allowing you to fly straight off of them, and trying to catch up in those situations is a nightmare, as speed boosting items plus slipperiness never makes for a good combo. That being said, the king of slipperiness is without a doubt the Mario Kart that started it all, with extremely tight turns, many of which will leave you off course, an extremely awkward drifting system that often causes more harm than good, and cheating CPUs that never let you stay ahead of them for more than 2 seconds. Super Mario Kart Special Cup to this day remains the hardest cup in the franchise's history. Well, at least in my opinion. Maybe one day I'll get that illustrious gold cup in 150cc, but let's be real, Elden Ring's DLC is looking far more manageable than that. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do consider subscribing. Again, feel free to toast me up in the comments for my mediocre driving abilities. You can spam skill issue if you want as well, that's all fine by me. Hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next video.